The morning I signed the papers on a condemned motel in the middle of nowhere, my mother looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You've lost your mind. You're going to die broken alone and you'll deserve it." She didn't say it quietly. She said it the way people say things they've been wanting to say for a long time. I was 29 years old. I had $11,000 left in my checking account after the down payment, a '09 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard, and a storage unit in Tucson full of furniture. I couldn't afford to move anywhere. My marriage had ended 8 months earlier. My ex-husband had walked away with the house, the friends, and, somehow, I still don't fully understand how, the dog. My mother had told me then, too, that it was my fault, that I was too stubborn, that I never knew how to hold on to good things. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the motel wasn't just a motel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My father's family had owned a small property management company in southern Arizona for about 30 years. Nothing glamorous. They handled rentals, did basic maintenance contracts, managed a few commercial spaces on the outskirts of town. When my grandfather passed, my dad took it over, and when I was old enough to understand spreadsheets, I started helping. Unofficially at first. Then more and more until by the time I was 25, I was essentially running the day-to-day operations, while my dad played golf 4 times a week, and my older brother spent his time building a personal brand on LinkedIn that nobody asked for. My brother's name is Colton. He's 4 years older than me, and he has the kind of confidence that doesn't come from competence. It comes from never having been told no. He'd worked at the company for 3 years without once learning how to read a lease agreement. But he was charming and loud and he looked good in a blazer, so everyone assumed he was the capable one. When my dad announced he was bringing Colton on as a co-director, I asked about my own title. I'd been doing the work for 4 years. I knew every vendor, every tenant, every clause in every contract we had. My dad looked at me with a kind of patient, tired expression, like I was a child asking why the sky was blue. "Colton has a business degree," he said. "I got my real estate license 2 years ago," I said. "And I'm the one who renegotiated the Harwell contract and saved us $40,000 last spring." He nodded slowly. "You're great in a support role, sweetheart." I went home that night and sat in my kitchen for a long time. 3 months later, Colton made his first major decision as co-director. He signed a vendor deal without reading the exclusivity clause. It locked us into a single maintenance contractor at inflated rates for 5 years. When I flagged it, he told me I was being negative. When I showed my father the numbers, he told me every business has growing pains. When the divorce happened and I lost the house, I also lost my reason to stay in the city. So I quit. I gave 2 weeks' notice. My father looked genuinely surprised, and my mother called me that same evening to tell me I was throwing my life away. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a small town called Marana, about 20 minutes northwest of Tucson. I had some savings. I had a plan, loose, half-formed, but mine. I'd spent years managing other people's properties. I wanted one of my own. That's when I found the Desert Pines Motor Lodge. It had been closed since 2008. 16 units in an L shape around a cracked concrete courtyard, a small office building at the front with plywood over the windows, and a detached storage structure in the back that looked like it had survived a minor explosion. The listing said fixer-upper with commercial potential, which is real estate language for we are begging someone, anyone, to take this off our hands. The asking price was $42,000 for 16 units, a quarter-acre of land, and a building that had been sitting empty for 16 years. I drove out to look at it on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The woman showing it, a local agent named Paulette, who had the energy of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, walked me through the office and the first few units without saying much. "Previous owner?" I asked. "Old rancher. Name was Silas Drummond. Bought it in the 90s, ran it for about a decade, then just stopped. Moved back east to be near family. Left everything. Taxes went unpaid for a few years, county took it. It's been in limbo since. Who's been maintaining it?" Paulette looked at me. "Nobody. The units were bad. Mold in 2 of them, a collapsed ceiling in Unit 7, all the fixtures stripped out of Units 12 through 14, probably by scrappers. The courtyard was full of dead creosote and broken glass. The pool, which showed up in old listing photos as a cheerful blue rectangle, had become a habitat for something I chose not to investigate. But the bones were solid, adobe construction which holds up in the desert in a way wood never does. The roof on the main office was newer than everything else. Somebody had replaced it at some point, and then apparently abandoned the project entirely. The electrical panel was outdated but not destroyed. I stood in the middle of the courtyard in the afternoon sun and did the math in my head the way I'd done math for years in someone else's office. Renovation costs, permit fees, the timeline, the potential. There was a new distribution center being built 6 miles down the highway. Contractors and logistics workers needed somewhere to stay. The closest decent motel was 40 minutes away. I called Paulette the next morning and made an offer. My family's reaction was immediate and unanimous. My mother, a motel? A broken motel in the desert? After everything that's happened? My father, quieter, but somehow worse. Honey, you don't have the capital for something like this. You should come back to the company. We'll work something out. Colton sent me a text that just said, "Lol, I signed the papers on a Thursday. I used almost everything I had." And then I drove out to Desert Pines with a flashlight and a notepad, and I started walking through what was now mine. That's when I found the storage building. I'd been through it briefly with Paulette during the showing, but only glanced at it. It was full of old furniture, rolled-up carpet, boxes of motel supplies from the early 2000s. I hadn't paid much attention, but on my own, with a flashlight and no agenda, I started moving things. Behind a stack of mattresses that had been pushed against the far wall, I mean really pushed, deliberately with effort, there was a door, not a closet. A door that had been drywalled over and then covered with pegboard and then hidden behind the mattresses. You wouldn't have found it unless you were either looking for it or, like me, just bored and methodical and slightly obsessive about understanding every inch of a property you'd just bought. I stood there for a moment. Why on earth would someone go to that much trouble to hide a door in a storage building behind a condemned motel in the Arizona desert? My first thought was that it was nothing. Utility access. An old crawl space, something boring. My second thought was, what if it isn't? I found the edge of the drywall with a box cutter and cut around the door frame. The door itself was metal, heavy, painted the same beige as everything else but slightly off. A shade too uniform, like it had been painted recently-ish compared to everything around it. There was a combination lock on a hasp on the outside. I stared at that lock for a long time. I drove to the hardware store, bought a bolt cutter, came back and handled it. The room on the other side was small, maybe 8 feet by 10. Concrete walls, no windows. A single bare bulb on a pull chain that miraculously worked when I connected the temporary power I'd had turned on at the breaker. And inside that room were filing cabinets. 4 of them full-size, the old olive green metal kind, and stacked in the corner, a row of plastic storage bins with lids, sealed with tape. I opened the first filing cabinet, land records, survey maps, correspondence with the Arizona State Land Department dating back to 1987. Water rights documentation, pages and pages of it, technical and dense, referencing something called the Drummond Aquifer Parcel, which I had never heard of. I sat down on the concrete floor and started reading. Silas Drummond hadn't just owned a motel. He had, at some point in the late 1980s, successfully filed a claim on a section of subsurface water rights beneath and adjacent to his property. Rights that had never been transferred, never been sold, and never been absorbed into any subsequent county or state transaction because nobody had known to look for them. Water rights in Arizona are not a small thing. In a state that is functionally a desert, water rights are the difference between a piece of land being worth $50,000 and worth $50 million. Developers, municipalities, agricultural operations, they fight over water rights constantly, expensively, and sometimes for decades. The rights that Silas had filed were tied to a substantial aquifer system. The documentation showed he'd done it quietly, without fanfare, apparently just as a hedge. He'd had the land surveyed on his own dime, found the water, filed the paperwork, and then never done anything with it. And when he left in 2008, he apparently forgot, or didn't realize, or didn't care, because none of it appeared in the property transfer to the county. It was a separate filing under his personal name, and it had just been sitting in those cabinets ever since. I spent 3 days reading everything in that room. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Deirdre Castillo, and she had been doing water rights and land use law in Tucson for 20 years. She was small and precise, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. And when I spread Silas Drummond's documents across her conference table, she went very quiet for a long time. "Where did you find these?" she asked. I told her. She took her glasses off, put them back on. These are valid filings, she said. If they haven't been challenged or superseded, and based on what I'm looking at, they haven't, these rights transferred with the property. Which means they transferred to the county. Which means when you purchased the property, she trailed off. They transferred to me, I said. She looked at me over her glasses. I need to do a full title search and verify the chain of ownership, but yes, that's what this suggests. I sat back in my chair. Outside the window, a city bus went by. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. How significant is this? I asked. Deirdre took a long breath. There's a development project, she said carefully. A large resort and residential community. About 4 miles from your property. It's been in planning for 2 years. The environmental approval was contingent on securing adequate water sourcing. She paused. They've been trying to acquire water rights in that corridor for 18 months. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. You've lost your mind. You're going to die broke and alone. What happens, I said, if they can't get them? The development project was called Saguaro Ridge. It was backed by a company called Meridian Land Partners, which was, as I discovered over the following weeks, partly capitalized by my father's business contacts. Not a direct connection, nothing so clean, but close enough that when the story eventually came out, it was going to be uncomfortable for everyone. That part I didn't know yet. What I did know was that Meridian had been buying up parcels in the area for 2 years. They'd been moving quietly, not publicizing their acquisitions, and they had plans. I found them in the county planning records for a resort and planned residential community that would require significant water infrastructure. The environmental review had flagged water sourcing as a potential constraint. They'd been working on solving that constraint for a long time, and the solution, as far as anyone had known before I came along, was to access a specific aquifer system in the western section of the corridor. The same one I now had rights to. I didn't do anything right away. I had Deirdre begin the verification process quietly. In the meantime, I started the renovation on the motel. I hired a local contractor named Pete, who was 70 years old and had been building things in the desert his entire life and had strong opinions about proper adobe maintenance. I got my permits. I gutted the damaged units and started from scratch. My family during this period was not supportive. My mother called every 2 weeks to check on what she clearly believed was my slow-motion financial implosion. My father mentioned once that there was still a position for me at the company if I wanted to stop all this. Colton posted on social media about the importance of smart risk-taking versus emotional decision-making, which everyone who knew us understood was about me. I did not explain what I'd found. I had learned slowly and painfully that my family had a specific way of responding to my good news. They found a way to either minimize it or take it from me. I wasn't going to let that happen this time. What I didn't anticipate was that they'd come looking on their own. It was a Saturday morning in June, about 4 months after I'd bought the property. I was in Unit 3 with a paint roller when I heard a car on the gravel outside. 2 cars, actually. I came out into the courtyard and found my father standing there, and next to him a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, in a collared shirt, the kind of tan you get from golf rather than outdoor work. Thought we'd come see what you've been up to, my father said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were moving around the property in a way that wasn't casual at all. Who's this? I said. Randall Bauer, the man said, extending his hand. I'm with Meridian Land Partners. We're doing some development work in the area. I shook his hand and said nothing. They walked the property. My father kept making comments about how much work it still needed, how the market for budget accommodations was tough, how I should really think about whether this was the right direction. Randall Bauer asked polite questions about the lot size and the storage structure in the back. I watched him look at that storage building and felt something cold settle in my chest. What do you use the back building for? He asked. Storage, I said. Mind if I take a look? Yeah, actually, I said, I do. He smiled. My father looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one he wore when he thought I was being difficult for no reason. They left an hour later. That evening I called Deirdre and told her we needed to accelerate the verification timeline. 3 weeks later, the title search came back clean. The water rights were mine. 2 days after that, someone broke the window on the storage building. I want to be clear about the sequence of events because it matters. First the visit. Then the title confirmation. Then the broken window. Then, 1 week after that, the power to the storage building was cut. not at the breaker, but at the line running from the main building, which had been physically severed with something. Then a certified letter arrived from Meridian Land Partners, offering to purchase my property for $68,000, framed as a generous offer on a distressed property. I did not respond to the letter. I installed cameras. I hired a security company to do weekly checks. And I had Deirdre send a letter of her own to Meridian Land Partners, formally notifying them that I was aware of the water rights documentation, that I had completed a title verification, and that any further interference with my property would be met with legal action. The response from Meridian took 4 days. It was a different kind of letter, longer, more formal, and written in the specific language of people who have expensive attorneys and are beginning to be worried. They wanted to negotiate. What happened next is that my father called me. "I need you to understand something," he said. His voice was different from usual, tighter. "Randall Bauer has been a business associate of mine for 11 years. I introduced him to that project. A lot of people I know have money in it." "Okay," I said. "The water situations, they need a resolution. The whole project is stalled. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand it means they need something I have," I said. A pause. "Don't be like this." "Like what? Difficult, vindictive?" His voice dropped into something that was trying to sound reasonable. "Nobody knew about the water rights, it was an oversight. You got lucky. But this project, it's going to create jobs, it's going to be good for the region. You'd be the one standing in the way of that." I thought about every spreadsheet I'd ever made in his office, every contract I'd negotiated, every time he'd handed me a support role and handed Colton a title. "I'll have my attorney reach out," I said and hung up. My mother showed up at the property the following week, not with my father, alone, which was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately. She'd driven 2 hours and she looked tired in a way I didn't associate with her. She stood in the courtyard, which by that point was clean, re-graveled, with 2 new potted saguaros flanking the entrance to the office, and looked around at what I'd done. "It's coming along," she said grudgingly. "Thanks," I said. We sat at a folding table I'd set up under the overhang outside the office. I made coffee. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Your father is in a difficult position," she said finally. "I know, these people, Randall and his partners, they're threatening to sue him. They're saying he misrepresented the property situation when he made introductions." I didn't say anything. "He didn't know," she said, "about the water rights. He genuinely didn't know." "I believe that," I said. "He didn't know because nobody ever looked into the property before they started building their plans around it. That's not my problem." She looked at me. "Couldn't you just sell them what they need?" "At a fair price, maybe," I said. But the offer they made wasn't a fair price. It was $68,000 for a property that's worth substantially more now, with water rights that are worth substantially more than that. "How much more?" "That's what we're negotiating." She was quiet. The desert was loud in the specific way it gets in late June. Cicadas, the creak of the aluminum overhang expanding in the heat, the distant sound of highway traffic. "I didn't mean it," she said quietly. "What I said when you signed the papers, that you'd die broke and alone." I looked at my coffee. "You said it though," I said. She nodded. "I know. The negotiation took 3 months. Deirdre was extraordinary, methodical and relentless and utterly unbothered by the pressure Meridian's attorneys tried to apply. At one point they suggested I had a legal obligation to sell because the water rights had been improperly filed by Silas Drummond, a claim Deirdre dismantled in writing in about 4 pages and never brought up again. What I ended up with was a long-term water rights lease agreement, not a sale. They could access the aquifer for their development, under specific terms, with a payment structure that included an upfront fee and annual royalties tied to the scale of the project. The upfront fee was $840,000. I'm going to write that out because the first time Deirdre said it out loud, I made her repeat it. $840,000. Colton found out through my father. He called me that same afternoon. "I had no idea you were sitting on something like that," he said. His tone was different from the text he'd sent me 9 months earlier. The Lolo-K energy was completely gone. "No," I said. "You didn't. If the family had known, the family told me I was going to die broken alone," I said. So, a pause. "Look, I'm just saying, if there's anything we can do to help." "I have everything I need," I said. "But thank you." The motel reopened in September of that year. 12 of the 16 units renovated. Clean and simple, desert modern, the kind of place that isn't trying to be a boutique hotel but also isn't depressing. The distribution center 6 miles down the highway had started operations in August. By the second week, I had a consistent occupancy rate of around 70%. The Saguaro Ridge development broke ground the following spring. From the roof of my office building on clear mornings, you can see the construction equipment moving against the mountains in the distance. My father came to see me alone about a month after the lease agreement was finalized. He stood in the courtyard the same way Randall Bauer had, looking around at what I'd built, except his face was different, complicated. "I want to apologize," he said. "Okay," I said. "I underestimated you for a long time. He paused. I think I was more comfortable seeing you in a certain kind of role, and that wasn't fair." I looked at him. He was older than I thought of him, grayer. "I accept your apology," I said. "And I need you to know that I'm not interested in coming back to the company. This is what I'm doing now." He nodded slowly. "It's a good property," he said. "I know," I said. "There's a moment I keep coming back to. It's not the moment Deirdre told me the number. It's not the moment I cut that lock off the door in the storage building. It's not even the morning I signed the papers, with my mother's voice still ringing in my ears. It's standing alone in that small concrete room, under a single bare bulb, reading pages of water rights documentation written in 1987 by an old man named Silas Drummond, who'd filed a claim and then driven away and left it to whoever came next. I don't know why he did it that way. Maybe he was protecting it from someone. Maybe he just forgot. Maybe he figured the land would take care of itself, the way desert land tends to do, patient, indifferent, full of things that survive not because they're dramatic about it but because they're stubborn. I understand that, I think. The Desert Pines Motor Lodge has a 5-star review average on 3 booking platforms now. Paulette, the agent who showed it to me, booked a room for her anniversary and left me a review that said, and I'm quoting exactly, "Never would have believed it. Neither would I, but here we are."